She had to get married within 45 days. Otherwise, her foster aunt's entire trust fund would be transferred to another foundation. And worst of all, everything she and her aunt had built together over the past 7 years could vanish, just because a single signature didn't make it in on time. Claire tightened her grip on the stack of documents in her hands. The lawyer sitting across from her looked at her with sympathy, but the words coming out of his mouth were colder than the office AC blasting overhead. She didn't want you facing everything you're pursuing alone. A life partner would be a support system. Support system? The only word echoing in Claire's mind was control. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt like she'd just choked down lead. Claire Bennett wasn't the kind of woman who backed down because of emotions. She'd spent hours arguing with professors at NYU just to defend an unpopular anthropological perspective. She'd gone into remote areas for fieldwork during a flu outbreak. She and her aunt, the strongest woman she had ever known, had built a nonprofit supporting mental health for immigrant communities. And now, because of one car accident on a rainy night, all of that was about to be decided by her marital status? Absolutely insane. Claire glanced at the wooden-framed photo on the desk. Her foster aunt, Evelyn, with silver hair, sharp eyes, always in a crisp white shirt, and never one to lie about how she felt. "You are fire. But if you don't learn where to place it, you'll burn down the very things you love," she once said. Claire knew this condition wasn't Evelyn's way of punishing her. Evelyn never did anything without a reason. But knowing that, and living with it, were two very different things. "And if I don't do it?" Claire asked, her voice nearly daring him. The lawyer sighed and pulled out another set of documents. "Then the entire fund will be transferred to the Mind Forward Foundation, as per the secondary clause in her will. They're already prepared to receive it." Strike two. Claire sank back into the chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. She could hear the clock ticking, like it was counting down the seconds of her life. "There's one more thing," Kate, the lawyer, said hesitantly. Claire sat back up, weary. "Another plot twist?" "Not exactly. But Mrs. Evelyn once mentioned an old acquaintance. She believed he might be a safe option." Claire let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You mean a qualified candidate for the legal husband position? You know Dr. Mason Rivers, don't you?" In that moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The vein at the back of Claire's neck tightened. "I've met him before," she said quietly. 2 years ago, a seminar on the use of neuroscience in treating anxiety disorders. Claire had arrived late, and the only empty seat left was right next to the man everyone referred to as the medical prodigy, Dr. Mason Rivers. She couldn't remember a single thing from the presentation that day, but she remembered his eyes when she asked a challenging question about the ethics of clinical trials. Those eyes weren't angry, weren't annoyed, just so void of emotion it sent a chill down her spine, as if he didn't see the human in her question, only a variable that needed eliminating. After the seminar, they didn't exchange another word. Claire never thought she'd hear that name again. "Did he agree to it?" she asked. Her voice now sounded different, like she was talking about a failed surgery. "We haven't reached out," the lawyer replied. "But Mrs. Evelyn once said, if there's anyone principled and cold enough not to mess up your life, it's Mason. He was also her husband's former student back in the day." This whole thing was starting to feel like a modern tragedy in contract marriage form. Claire stood up, gathering the documents. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll think about it." "You have 45 days, the lawyer reminded her. The air in the room suddenly turned heavy. Outside, rain had started to fall. Claire walked out of the building without an umbrella. With every step, only one question echoed in her mind. How did someone like me end up in a situation like this? And she had no idea. That same emotionless man who once sent chills down her spine in a lecture hall 2 years ago was about to become the only person who could keep her dream within reach. Under one condition, she had to agree to marry him. Claire returned to the law office the next morning. In her hand was a printed sheet with the details of a man she'd once sworn never to speak to again in this lifetime. But this time, she had no choice. 3 hours later, Claire stood in front of a high-rise building wrapped in blue-tinted glass, headquarters of the Sterling Neurological Institute. She didn't need to ask what floor Mason Rivers was on, because it was the only floor without a directory. A man like him didn't need a nameplate for people to find him. The assistant led her to a private conference room, saying, "Dr. Rivers will be with you in a few minutes. But when she walked in, Mason was already there. His back was to the window, arms crossed. His shoulders didn't flinch at the sound of the door opening, as if he knew the exact moment each person would appear. Claire didn't say anything for the first few seconds. She just looked at him. White lab coat without a single wrinkle, dark brown hair slicked neatly back, polished black shoes standing firm on the gray wooden floor. Nothing excessive, nothing soft. Exactly as she remembered him from 2 years ago. He turned around. Eyes met. Claire Bennett, he said her name like a statement, not a greeting. Dr. Rivers. She nodded. Didn't think we'd meet again. You're here to talk about the trust fund, he said immediately, voice flat and emotionless. And a proposal. She sat down across from him, opened her bag, and pulled out a draft contract the lawyer had prepared overnight. Her voice was calm, almost bureaucratic. I need to keep that fund. Not for personal gain, but because hundreds of people will be left behind if my organization shuts down. And what do I get? Mason cut in. You'll gain access to the Foundation's network, including funding for several of your proposed studies that were previously rejected due to budget constraints. He stayed silent. She continued. I'm proposing a legal marriage for 1 year. After that, we mutually agree to divorce. No strings attached. No lawsuits. No emotions? No emotions, she confirmed. Mason stepped closer to the table. She noticed every movement of his was so precise, it felt unconscious, like he'd been programmed. You think I don't have better options? I don't know, she replied. But I do know you're someone who understands the value of a transparent agreement. Silence stretched for nearly a full minute. Finally, he slid the contract back toward her. No. Claire stood up. Thanks for your time. She walked out of the room without looking back. Without saying another word. 2 days later, her phone rang at 6:17 a.m. The number wasn't saved, but she knew exactly who it was. Claire Bennett. Mason's voice came through the phone, steady, unmistakable. Calling this early because you changed your mind? I agree, he said, but with conditions. I'm listening. We don't get involved in each other's lives. No checking in, no obligations, no expectations beyond what's legally required. And no emotions. Claire stated it before he could. Exactly. The wedding took place in a judicial office tucked inside the administrative district. No music, no rings, no flowers. Aside from Claire and Mason, there were only 2 others present, Claire's lawyer friend and Mason's personal assistant, standing in as witnesses. Claire wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair tied in a low ponytail. Mason wore a gray suit, jacket unbuttoned. When the officiant asked about wedding rings, Claire turned to him. Mason replied without hesitation, that object doesn't change how I act. She nodded. They signed. The relationship was made official in ink, and began with a handshake colder than the wind in the courthouse hallway. Claire moved into Mason's apartment on a Monday morning. No one picked her up, no welcome message, just an elevator code emailed to her, along with a short note, top floor, left unit, doors unlocked. The door slid open automatically as she stepped in. The space inside made Claire pause for a few seconds just to adjust. A penthouse apartment wrapped in glass walls, opening up to the cityscape below. High ceilings, natural light flooding every corner. Everything was flawless. Dark hardwood floors, stainless steel kitchen cabinets, black leather chairs aligned with laser precision. A single color palette, white, gray, black. It felt more like stepping into a model home than a place someone actually lived in. The fridge was empty. The bookshelf had books, but none that looked touched. No family photos, no souvenirs, no trace of a life. This apartment held no memories, only order. Claire's room was on the east side. Mason said nothing when she moved in. He didn't even appear. An assistant had dropped off a new set of keys, along with a few papers to sign. Claire dropped her luggage and collapsed onto the cold white bed, the silence ringing in her ears. The first day passed without her seeing her husband. The second day did too. On the third day, Claire woke up and found a cup of hot coffee on the kitchen counter. Her usual order, low sugar, extra milk, a small cinnamon stick. No note, no message. Just a perfectly timed, perfectly placed cup of coffee. She thought she might have imagined it. But the next day, there was another cup. And again, the day after that. Claire started to notice more. The flower vase in the kitchen changed every 3 days. Not artificial. Real flowers, tulips, white chrysanthemums, lavender. Whoever was choosing them never repeated the same kind. The shirts and scarves Claire sent out for cleaning always came back neatly folded, along with a small handwritten note. Strong winds. Rain expected. Temperature dropping 6 degrees tonight. No name, no signature. Claire asked the building assistant, asked the part-time cleaner. Everyone said the same thing. They didn't know. They just followed the scheduled tasks. Mason remained unseen. He left early in the morning and came home after she was already asleep. Once, Claire stayed up late studying, and she heard the front door open. But by the time she stepped into the hallway, all she saw was the faint light from the office, door slightly ajar. Not a word. It was as if they existed in separate dimensions, sharing a roof, but never overlapping. Claire thought about breaking the silence, about reaching out. But then she stopped. Everything had happened so fast, so irrationally, and now she wasn't even sure where to begin. A week later, Claire felt her breath catch while watering the plants. Her throat burned, and her head swam. She tried to drink water, but her hand trembled too much to hold the glass steady. She dragged herself back to her room, telling herself it was just exhaustion. But the fever hit like a wave. Her vision blurred, her skin turned icy cold, then burned up again. The sheets couldn't keep her warm, and the ceiling lights were so blinding she had to press a pillow over her face. The last thing Claire remembered was falling off the bed. The final sound was a soft thud, her forehead hitting the wooden floor. Then everything went dark. She woke up in a dream. Or at least, that's what she thought. Someone was carrying her, strong arms, swift and purposeful steps. She caught the scent of something familiar, musk mixed with mint and a trace of cold wood. The smell of control, a scent only one person in this house could possibly wear. A man's voice said something, low, quick, and firm. Not clear enough to make out the words, but clear enough to be a command. Cold water dabbed her forehead. A damp cloth touched her neck. Something was placed under her tongue. Medication. The last thing she saw was the outline of a white lab coat, perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle in sight. When Claire woke up the second time, it was morning. The room was flooded with sunlight, and she was back in bed. Blankets tucked in neatly, a thermometer and glass of water set beside her pillow. She had no memory of doing any of it herself. She tried to sit up. Her throat was dry, and her wrists ached. Next to her was a bottle of prescription medication. Beneath it, a folded note. A medication schedule written by hand, divided by the hour. The handwriting was slanted, clean, precise, every stroke deliberate. The cold towel someone had used to wipe her face the night before still rested on the chair. It still held the faint scent of mint and musk. Claire looked around the quiet room. She knew, without a doubt, that even though no one was here now, someone had crossed the icy line they'd built between them. And she began to wonder, what made someone like Mason Rivers do that, then vanish like it never happened? Claire never brought up that night. She didn't ask about the prescription bottle or the neatly handwritten medication schedule. Everything remained exactly as it was, untouched, unspoken. And it seemed Mason chose silence too. But from that night on, Claire found herself watching him differently. A week later, Claire traveled with her organization to a remote area a few hours outside the city. They were conducting fieldwork on migrant workers' access to healthcare, a high-stakes project involving international partners, so Claire went in person. The minivan was mid-route when the rain hit. The road slickened fast, and the tires lost grip as the driver swerved sharply around a bend. Claire barely registered the scream and the sound of metal colliding before her body was flung forward. Everything shattered in a flash. Then, darkness. Her colleague, the community program manager, called for an ambulance immediately. Claire was rushed to the nearest local hospital, unconscious. Her pulse was present, but her pupils were slow to respond. The doctors suspected a concussion. She was too unstable to move. In the emergency contact section of Claire's file, her colleague spotted an unfamiliar name. Emergency contact, Dr. Mason Rivers. She didn't know the details, only that he was listed as legal guardian. Without hesitating, she made the call. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles away, Mason Rivers was standing in the main operating room of a major hospital. A highly complex brain surgery was underway, one that had been scheduled for 6 months. The patient, a high-profile businessman recently diagnosed with a deep-seated meningioma, rare, dangerous, and closely followed by the media due to his celebrity status. The hospital's internal broadcast played in the waiting room. A few members of the board of directors were present. The pressure was so intense that junior surgeons broke into a cold sweat just hearing the case name. But Mason stood firm. He had spent nearly half a year preparing for this moment. Everything was under control, until his assistant burst into the OR, holding out a phone. Emergency. It's about your wife. Mason looked at her for 3 seconds. Then, he removed his gloves, took off his stethoscope, and grabbed his comm unit. "Send in the deputy chief. I'm leaving. Dr. Rivers, you can't walk out on this procedure. Hand it off, right now." He walked straight out, leaving the entire operating room in stunned silence. The private helicopter took off within 30 minutes. No announcement, no explanation. While people were still arguing and trying to figure out what was happening, Mason was already in the air, his eyes locked on the CT brain scan just sent from the local hospital. He read it as the aircraft shook from turbulence. His eyes never blinked. By the time Mason arrived, Claire was still in recovery. She hadn't regained consciousness. A bruise swelled on her forehead, her hair matted and tangled, her skin pale as paper. He stepped into the room without a word, pulled a chair close to the bed, and laid his hand gently over hers, cold and motionless. The nurse started to ask for paperwork, but when she saw his eyes, bloodshot and steely, she quietly stepped out without saying a word. Claire opened her eyes a few hours later. The first light she saw came from the ceiling lamp. The second, a quiet figure sitting beside her, her hand still resting in his. His lab coat was marked with a few spots of dried blood, unclear whose. The dark circles under his eyes were deep, as if he hadn't slept in a week. "Mason?" Her voice was hoarse. He gently tightened his grip on her hand, confirming he wasn't a hallucination. "Do you remember anything?" "A little. Was it an accident?" "Mild concussion. No internal damage, but you were unconscious too long." Claire blinked. Why are you here? Weren't you supposed to be in surgery?" "No one mattered more than you in that moment," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. She opened her mouth to say something, but a sharp pain pulsed through her forehead, stopping her cold. Mason stood, adjusted her pillow, pressed the nurse call button. Every move was quick, practiced, but for the first time, Claire noticed. His hands were shaking. The next day, the headlines were everywhere. "Genius surgeon walks out of operating room for his new wife, scandal or sacrifice." The hospital board demanded an official explanation. Mason gave none. He simply submitted the surgical transfer report signed by the deputy chief and walked out of the meeting. The result: a 1-week suspension pending internal review. Rumors flew, speculations spread, but Mason didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. Claire found out after she'd been discharged. She was sitting on the balcony of the penthouse, staring at her phone. Each word in the article felt like a hammer to the chest. She used to think he was emotionless, but that day, when he sat beside her in the recovery room, holding her hand for hours in silence, eyes sunken and sleepless, she finally understood. Emotion wasn't something Mason lacked. He just buried it deeper than most could even imagine. And when it finally surfaced, he was willing to risk everything. For one person. For her. Claire spent countless nights unable to sleep after learning Mason had been suspended. She blamed herself, though he never once did. Each day that passed, the apartment grew quieter. He no longer left her morning coffee. No more weather notes tucked beside her laundry. Not out of anger, but because somehow, it seemed even he didn't know how to step out of the silence they'd built. One afternoon, while rummaging through a drawer, she found the same towel from that feverish night, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. That scent stirred something deep, something unresolved. Claire made a decision. She needed to understand the man she was living with. Once and for all. She couldn't keep coexisting with someone who felt more like a shadow than a person. She began with what she knew. The hospital, the med school, the scientific papers bearing Mason Rivers' name. But the information was shockingly scarce. No interviews, no social media, no personal photos. His online presence was nearly wiped clean, as if someone had deliberately erased him from the internet. Until she started digging into the neurological research grants in the region. In an old article from 3 years ago, one investment fund kept popping up, MR Ventures. Claire found the fund's website, bare bones, with no detailed bios or flashy introductions. Just a few featured projects, all tied to neuroscience and brain rehabilitation. Some of the names were familiar. Research institutes where Mason had once taught part-time, small-scale programs that her own nonprofit had partnered with. Curious and unsettled, she reached out to her best friend, a financial attorney, and asked her to trace the fund's real owner. After peeling back several layers of shell companies, the name that surfaced left Claire speechless. Mason Rivers. MR wasn't just a random abbreviation. It stood for Mason Rivers. The entire fund, worth tens of millions of dollars, was his personal asset. and Mason had been funding hundreds of medical research projects without ever attaching his name. Claire was still reeling when her friend added, "He used to be one of the largest shareholders in that medical tech corporation, right? Before he sold everything, after that scandal almost 10 years ago." Claire went quiet. Her friend didn't know much more, but in Claire's mind, the puzzle pieces were starting to connect. She dove back into the old records. That company had once been a rising star in the medical tech world, pioneering neurosurgical devices, until everything crashed. The CEO had been arrested for falsifying clinical data. The scandal tanked the stock. The company went bankrupt. Thousands of employees lost their jobs overnight. And listed among the final top shareholders, just barely into his 20s, was Mason Rivers. A smaller, less circulated article mentioned that Mason's mother, a former psychiatrist, had passed away shortly after the scandal erupted. No official cause of death was ever confirmed, but sources speculated she suffered from severe depression triggered by the media fallout. Claire couldn't find a photo of her. But she remembered Mason's eyes that night in the recovery room, the way he held her hand, silent, like he was trying to keep something from breaking open. The next day, Claire waited for him in the living room. No script, no rehearsed questions, just a quiet certainty that she couldn't keep pretending anymore. Mason walked in near dusk, his coat still dusty from the day. He paused when he saw her standing there, file in hand. "You were the sole heir. You own a medical investment fund backing dozens of neuroscience projects across the country." He said nothing. "You funded my organization, and I had no idea." Still no response. "Why did you hide it?" Mason took off his coat and laid it over the chair. The light cast shadows across his exhausted face. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Because money doesn't bring back the dead." Claire didn't interrupt. He kept going. "The day I found out my mother died, I was in a shareholders meeting. The company's stock had just crashed. Everyone was shouting about damage control and media strategy. I just sat there, did nothing. No one in that room knew she'd overdosed." Claire felt her throat tighten. "A year later, I sold everything. Didn't keep a single piece of that empire. I went back to school, chose the one field I'd avoided, medicine, because I needed to give something back, anything, even if it was just once." She looked at him quietly. "And you chose to live like you had nothing left. What's there left to show off?" Mason looked up at her, something flickering in his eyes, something unshaped, unspoken. "I just wanted to do the work, quietly, be left alone. No one calling me a millionaire or a genius or the son of. I've had enough of all of it." Claire stared at him for a long time, and suddenly, all the things that once seemed small, the morning coffee, the weather notes, the handwritten prescriptions, even the way her organization had been saved at the last possible moment, they all came into focus with the same answer. "Everything you did for me, it was all you?" Mason didn't nod, didn't deny it. He just looked at her, as if to say, "Now you know. What you do with it is up to you." Claire turned away, not wanting him to see the tears in her eyes. She didn't know whether to thank him or to apologize. She only knew that behind the cold glass walls of this penthouse was a heart that had chosen silence for an entire lifetime. The first snow of the season came earlier than forecast. Fine white flakes, light as powdered chalk, fell across the apartment balcony, blurring the glass in a pale haze. Claire sat in the kitchen, her hand resting lightly on the cold wooden table. In front of her was a thin platinum ring, no gemstone, no engraving, just like their relationship, simple, defined, without promises. 1 year had passed. Today was the last day of the contract. Her organization now had enough funding to sustain itself independently. The trust fund was no longer necessary. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. Claire wrote a short letter. She didn't want a conversation. She didn't want to see Mason's eyes as she walked out the door, because she wasn't sure she'd have the strength to leave if she stayed even 1 second longer. She left the keys, the wedding ring, and the letter, then quietly stepped out of the apartment she had once thought would be nothing more than a temporary shelter, only to find it had become the first place in her life she didn't want to leave. Mason came home just before midnight. He tossed his coat over the chair, heading for his office, until he noticed the kitchen light was still on. He walked over and froze. The ring sat alone on the table, beside a neatly folded piece of paper. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. Bookmark. But he opened it anyway. His eyes moved over each line, his expression unchanged, but the hand holding the letter began to tremble. No one prepares you for what it feels like to be left behind and not be allowed to ask them to stay. He called. No answer. Texted. No reply. He reached out to his assistant, even Claire's best friend. None of them knew where she'd gone. But he remembered. There was one overnight train to New York, 11:40 p.m. The only one that ran straight through from the central station. He didn't pack anything. Mason bolted out the door in an old coat. No gloves, no hat. The wind cut across his face like blades. Snow clung to his hair, his shoulders, and the rising panic swelling in his chest. By the time he reached the station, the clock read 11:33. He sprinted up slick steps, eyes scanning the terminal. And then he saw her. Claire stood beneath the stairs, one hand on the handle of a small suitcase, her long coat brushing her knees. She stared at the ground, hadn't seen him yet. But when she finally looked up, their eyes met. Mason stopped in his tracks, heart pounding like a drum. She didn't run, didn't turn away. She just stood there, waiting for him to come closer. I wrote the letter instead of talking to you because I knew, she began, voice trembling, eyes red. If I said it out loud, I wouldn't be able to leave. You still don't have to go. Not because you need me to stay, she said, her voice soft but steady, but because you choose me to stay. Mason's hands clenched at his sides. He'd never been good with the right words, not at the right time. But this time, he didn't need a script. I've lived my whole life by logic, Mason said slowly. Carefully, calculated, keeping everything inside the safety zone. Then you came along, over something as ridiculous as a trust fund and a contract. You made me lose control. You're the only thing that's ever made me want to hold on to every feeling I spent years learning how to hide. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she took one step forward, wrapped her arms around him, and rested her face against his chest. I thought all I needed was a grant, she whispered. But what I got was a heart that had never been loved, and I want to learn how to love it. He held her tightly. No more distance, no more walls. No one boarded the 11:40 train that night. They left the station together, snow still falling, their hands entwined like they'd never let go. And when they returned to the apartment, Claire stepped inside first. But this time, Mason didn't walk the other way. He stepped into her room for the first time since the day she moved in. Not like a roommate, but like a husband, a real one. And the door closed quietly behind them, leaving outside everything that had once been just part of an agreement. Inside, there were two people, and one choice. Some relationships start with the word must, but end with the word want. Claire and Mason didn't choose each other in the beginning. They were placed inside a contract that seemed cold, impersonal, and unfair. But within that boundary, they learned how to truly see one another, not through conditions, but through kindness, honesty, and the courage to love. No grand promises, just actions. Because sometimes what we need isn't a perfect person, but someone patient enough to unlock the parts of ourselves we've spent a lifetime hiding. So what about you? What would you do if you found yourself in a marriage that began out of obligation, but somehow made you believe in love again? Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it stirred something in you, even just a little, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next emotional journey. And don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. See you in the next story.